The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. I remember gripping the edge of my station so hard, my claws left marks in the metal. Every screen on the bridge of the Concorde cruiser Halvex turned red at the same moment, and a voice I did not recognize came through every channel we owned, every frequency, every relay station across 1,000 systems, all at once. It was a human voice, calm, steady, almost gentle, and it said only this: "We are done asking." My name is Vesa Kothran, and I served the Concorde fleet for 11 cycles before the day everything changed. I am not human. I was not born on their small blue world, and for most of my life I never thought about humans at all, except as one thinks about furniture in a room you walk through every day without looking at it. They were there. They worked. They did not complain. That was all I knew, and that was all I needed to know, because the Concorde had taught every species under its banner the same lesson. Humans do not matter. Humans do not fight back. Humans simply endure. I want to tell you how wrong we were, and I want to tell you from the beginning, because the ending will not make sense unless you understand how deep our mistake went. Humanity joined the wider galaxy almost 80 cycles before the day of the broadcast. They arrived quietly, in slow ships, asking for nothing more than trade routes and a seat at meetings nobody important attended. The Concorde, an alliance of older species who had long since divided the stars between themselves, welcomed them the way a large predator welcomes a smaller animal into its territory. Not with violence, not at first, with paperwork, with tariffs, with treaties written in language designed to be misunderstood by anyone who had not spent 1,000 years learning to read between its lines. Humans signed those treaties anyway. They needed the trade. Their homeworld was rich in people and short on the resources that made ships fly and cities grow. So they took the deals we offered, even when those deals cost them more than they gained. I remember the first time I saw a human delegate in person, a woman named Grace Holloway, standing in a hall built for bodies twice her height, straining her neck to look up at Concorde officials who did not bother to look down at her. She spoke plainly. She asked for fair prices on fuel cells. She was denied, politely, and she thanked the council for their time before she left. I remember thinking, at the time, how strange it was that she did not seem angry. I understand now that she was not being weak, she was being patient. There is a difference, and it took us far too long to learn it. Over the following decades, humanity's colonies grew at the edges of Concorde space, in systems nobody else wanted, rocks too cold, or too dry, or too far from anything valuable. They built there anyway. They terraformed dust into farmland. They turned frozen moons into cities, and every time they succeeded somewhere the Concorde had written off as worthless, someone in the council found a new reason to take a piece of it away. A mining right revoked here, a shipping lane closed there. A human colony relocated because a Concorde survey team decided, after the humans had already spent 20 years building it, that the system had strategic value after all. I served on ships that carried out some of those relocations. I did not think of it as cruelty at the time. I thought of it as policy. We were following orders from a council that had ruled the stars since before my grandmother's grandmother was born, and humans were simply the newest, smallest voice in a room full of ancient ones. It did not occur to me that patience could run out. It did not occur to any of us. The incident that broke it happened on a route I had flown a dozen times myself, a quiet corridor between two mining systems where civilian traffic moved without escort because nothing ever happened there. A human transport ship, the Meridian Hope, carrying families and workers between colonies, was caught in the path of a Concorde training exercise that should never have been scheduled on an active civilian lane. The transport was destroyed. 211 people died, and when the human ambassador demanded an explanation, the council's response was 5 words long, translated and delivered without apology. The losses were within tolerance. I was in the chamber when those words were spoken. I saw the human ambassador, a man named Henry Voss, stand very still for a long moment. He did not shout. He did not threaten anyone. He simply thanked the council for their honesty, turned, and walked out. I remember a colleague of mine leaning over to whisper that humans truly had no spine at all, that even this, Even the deaths of their own children would not move them to anger. I laughed along with him. I am not proud of that now. What none of us understood, what none of us could have understood, was that Henry Voss was not walking away in defeat. He was walking away to make a call. For the following weeks, everything on the surface looked exactly the same. Human trade ships still moved through Concord space on their usual schedules. Human diplomats still attended their usual meetings, said their usual polite things, made their usual small requests that were usually denied. If you were watching only the surface, you would have believed nothing had changed at all. But I was not only watching the surface. I was a junior tactical officer by then, assigned to monitor shipping lanes near the human border, and I began to notice things that did not fit the pattern. Cargo manifests for outbound human freighters that did not match anything a mining colony would need. Long-range sensor pings from empty systems, systems with no colonies, no stations, nothing that should have drawn any traffic at all. When I flagged these anomalies to my superiors, I was told, more than once, that humans were not worth the attention, that whatever strange readings I was picking up were sensor error, or smuggling, or nothing at all. I let it go. I trusted the people above me. I was young, and I believed the galaxy worked the way I had been taught it worked. It did not occur to any of us that a species we had spent 80 years underestimating might spend those same 80 years building something we could not see. I think back now to the small things, the things that should have told us, the human worlds that stopped inviting outside contractors for their shipyards decades before, quietly, without explanation, citing budget concerns nobody bothered to question. The sudden interest human universities took in materials science and energy systems, framed publicly as academic curiosity, never as anything more. The way human colonies, even the poorest ones on the coldest rocks, always seemed to have more workers than their official population records could explain. We saw all of it. We understood none of it. We had decided, long before any of this began, exactly what humans were capable of, and we stopped looking any closer once that decision was made. That is the real danger of underestimating someone. It is not that you fail to see what they are doing, it is that you stop looking at all. The last thing I want to tell you from this part of the story is about the silence, because the silence came before the storm, and I remember it more clearly than almost anything else. 2 days before the broadcast, every human communication channel across Concord space went quiet at the exact same hour. Not gradually, not with warning, all at once, as if a single hand had reached out and turned off every light in every human room across 1,000 systems. Our analysts assumed it was some kind of internal crisis, a power failure, a political collapse, something happening on the human homeworld that had nothing to do with us. Nobody imagined it was a countdown. I remember sitting at my station during those 2 silent days, watching empty channels that should have carried the same polite, patient human voices I had heard my entire career, and feeling, for the first time, a kind of unease I could not explain. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of standing in a room and suddenly noticing how very quiet it has become, and wondering, too late, what that quiet actually means. I did not know yet that humanity had finally, after 80 years of tariffs and treaties and dead families and polite thank yous, decided that patience had run its course. I did not know that somewhere beyond our sensors, in systems we had never bothered to survey properly, fleets were waking up that had been built in secret across 3 generations, by people who had smiled through every humiliation we handed them and remembered every single one. I only knew that the silence felt wrong, and that some part of me, some part I did not yet have words for, understood that we were about to learn exactly how much we did not know about the species we had spent so long calling small. When the broadcast finally came, I was still at my station, still watching those same dead channels, when every screen on the ship turned red, and that calm, steady voice said the 5 words that would end the world I knew. We are done asking. And underneath those words, quieter, almost gentle, came 6 more, spoken slowly enough that no translator could miss them, spoken in a tone that held no anger at all, only certainty. Now you will finally listen. I did not know, in that moment, what was coming. None of us did. But I remember the cold feeling that settled into my chest as the message ended and the channel went silent again, and I remember thinking, for the first time in 11 cycles of service, that perhaps we had built our entire understanding of humanity on a foundation that had never been solid at all. I did not know how right that thought was. I would not understand the true size of our mistake until the fleets arrived. The council chamber had never been quiet like that before. I was not a member of the council, only a junior officer summoned to brief them on fleet readiness. But I stood near the back wall and watched the most powerful beings in known space stare at a star map that no longer made sense to them. Human fleets were appearing at every major border crossing at once. Not one fleet, not 10. Dozens, spread across 1,000 light-years, arriving in formations nobody in that room had ever trained against, because nobody in that room had ever believed such formations would be necessary. I watched an admiral named Orin Fesk, a being who had commanded conquered forces for longer than most species live, stand up from his chair and simply say, quietly, that the numbers on the screen could not be correct. Nobody corrected him. Nobody could. I had seen human ships before. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, a handful of aging patrol craft that Concord regulations allowed them to keep for policing their own colonies, nothing that could ever challenge a real warship. What appeared on that map bore no resemblance to any of it. The ships were larger, sleeker, built from materials our own scanners struggled to identify. Their engines produced no exhaust signature we recognized, which meant our sensor net, built over centuries to track every ship in known space, was suddenly half-blind. And there were so many of them, row after row, system after system, as if an entire civilization had spent generations building a second fleet in secret, hidden behind the polite, patient mask of a species we had decided was too weak to be worth watching closely. I want to be honest about what I felt in that chamber, because I think it matters. I did not feel proud of my people in that moment. I felt afraid, and beneath the fear, something colder, something like shame, because I understood, faster than most of the officers around me, exactly how this had happened. We had built our entire strategy around the assumption that humans could not do this. Every treaty, every tariff, every colony taken, and every complaint dismissed, all of it rested on the belief that humanity had no way to answer us and no will to try. Standing in that chamber, watching admirals who had commanded fleets for centuries go pale and silent, I understood that the belief itself had been the mistake, and that we had been given 80 years of warning signs and chosen every single time to look away. The council debated for 6 hours before deciding on a response, and even now I find their debate almost impossible to describe without a kind of disbelief. Some of them wanted to send an immediate diplomatic delegation, certain that a show of goodwill would calm whatever misunderstanding had caused this display. Others wanted to dismiss the fleets entirely as an elaborate bluff, a piece of theater meant to frighten concessions out of the council without any real intention of fighting. I remember a counselor named Rel Adden standing before the chamber and insisting, with total confidence, that humans had never fired a shot in anger in 80 years of contact and were biologically and culturally incapable of sustained warfare. He used that exact word, incapable, as if it were a scientific fact, rather than a hope dressed up as an argument. I was ordered back to my ship before the council reached its final decision, so I did not hear the vote myself, but I heard the outcome soon enough, because every fleet in the sector received the same order within the hour. Hold position. Do not engage. Await further instruction. It was, I think, the last moment the Concorde still believed it held the advantage, the last moment before reality forced its way into a room that had spent 80 years refusing to let it in. My ship, the Halvex, was stationed at a relay point near a system called Corvain, a modest trade hub with no particular strategic value, the kind of place nobody expected trouble to reach. I was on the bridge when the first human envoy ship crossed into the system, a single vessel, unarmed as far as our scanners could tell, broadcasting a request for a formal conversation with local Concorde command. My captain, a cautious officer named Dessa Thorne, agreed to receive it, mostly out of curiosity, I think, since none of us had any real experience negotiating with an armed and furious human government. The envoy who came aboard was a woman named Charlotte Pierce, and I remember her clearly because she carried herself with none of the anger I expected. She walked onto our bridge in a plain uniform, unarmed, flanked by no guards at all, and she asked to speak with our captain as if she were simply continuing a conversation that had been paused rather than starting a new and terrible one. Captain Thorne asked her, directly, what humanity wanted. I remember Charlotte's answer word for word, because it was so different from anything I expected to hear from someone representing a fleet capable of frightening an entire council into silence. She said humanity did not want territory. She said humanity did not want revenge for the Meridian Hope, or for the tariffs, or for the colonies taken and given back and taken again. She said humanity wanted one thing only, and that was for every species in this alliance to finally understand that humans were not a resource to be managed or a problem to be tolerated, but a people, with the same right to dignity as anyone else at that table. She said the fleets outside our windows were not there to conquer, but to make absolutely certain that no council, ever again, would look at a human life and call its loss acceptable with intolerance. Captain Thorne asked what would happen if the council refused to listen even now, with human fleets sitting at their border. Charlotte's answer was quiet, and I have never forgotten it. She said that humanity had already spent 80 years asking politely, and that this was not another request. It was a demonstration, and demonstrations, unlike requests, did not require anyone's permission to proceed. She left our ship less than an hour after she arrived, and I remember watching her small shuttle depart, flanked by two of those strange new human warships that our scanners still could not fully read, and thinking that I had just watched something enormous happen without a single shot being fired. I did not yet understand that the shots were coming regardless of what any of us decided, because the decision had already been made, not by the Council, but by an entire species that had finally run out of patience to spend. Word spread through the fleet within hours that the Council had rejected humanity's terms outright, insulted by the idea that a species they had ruled over for 80 years would dare present demands rather than requests. I was not surprised. I do not think anyone who had sat in that chamber and heard counselors like Reladine speak was surprised. Pride, I have come to believe, is a slower poison than fear, and it kills far more of the people who carry it. What I remember most clearly from those final hours before the fighting began was a conversation I had with a young human technician named Ethan Marsh, who had been assigned to a joint monitoring post near our relay station as part of an old trade agreement that had somehow survived the collapse of everything else. He was not a soldier. He fixed communication arrays, and he had worked alongside Concorde crews for 3 years without incident, quiet and competent and easy to overlook, exactly the way every human I had ever met had been. I asked him, foolishly, whether he believed his people could actually win a war against the entire Concorde. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and his answer has stayed with me every day since. He said his people had never once, in 80 years, expected to win by matching the Concorde ship for ship or system for system. He said humans had learned something different in that time, something older than the Concorde itself. He said they had learned that a species willing to be patient for 80 years while it prepared was far more dangerous than a species that simply reacted in anger, because anger burns out, but patience, once it finally moves, does not stop until it has finished what it set out to do. I did not sleep that night. I do not think anyone in the fleet slept. I remember standing at the viewport of the Halvex, looking out at the same quiet stars I had looked at 1,000 times before, and understanding, finally, that the galaxy I had known my entire life was about to end, and that we had built its ending ourselves, one dismissed complaint, one broken treaty, one acceptable loss at a time, without ever once believing the people we were doing it to would remember, or would ever have the strength to make us pay for forgetting that they would. The order to stand down never came. Instead, at the exact hour the Council's deadline for a response expired, every human fleet at every border crossing moved forward at once, and the war that the galaxy had spent 80 years pretending could never happen finally, quietly, and without any further warning, began. I have relived the first hour of that engagement many times since, and I still cannot describe it without my hands shaking. Even now, even so long after everything ended. I was at my station on the Halvex when the sensor net lit up with contacts we could not classify, moving in formations that broke every rule of fleet tactics we had studied since our first year of training. Concord doctrine relied on numbers and coordinated waves, ship after ship pressing forward in a slow, grinding advance that had worked for centuries against every enemy we had ever faced. Humanity did not fight that way at all. Their ships moved like something alive, splitting apart and reforming faster than our targeting systems could track, striking at the seams of our formations rather than the center, finding the exact places where our defenses were thinnest, and pulling them apart before we understood we had even been touched. I remember Captain Thorne shouting orders that our own tactical computer could not keep pace with, because every plan we tried to build was already outdated by the time it reached the crews meant to carry it out. A young officer beside me, a Concord native named Priln Vass, kept repeating that it did not make sense, that no species without 100 years of continuous warfare could fight with this kind of coordination. I understood, watching those formations move, what humanity had actually spent their 80 years of silence doing. They had not simply been building ships. They had been building an entirely new way of fighting, tested and refined in secret, waiting for the one moment it would finally be needed. Our first real contact came near the edge of the Corvain system, where two Concord battle groups moved to intercept a human formation that our scanners insisted was smaller than our own. I remember the confidence in Captain Thorne's voice as she gave the order to engage, certain that our numbers alone would carry the day the way they always had before. That confidence lasted perhaps 4 minutes. The human ships did not meet us head-on. They separated into smaller groups the instant our formations locked onto them, moving through gaps in our defense grid that should not have existed, striking at our support vessels first, rather than our warships, cutting off supply and communication before a single shot touched our strongest ships. I watched two Concord cruisers go dark within moments of each other, not destroyed exactly but disabled, their systems overwhelmed by something our engineers would later struggle for weeks to even understand. It was not raw power that beat us in those first minutes. It was precision and patience, and a kind of calm control that felt almost unnatural coming from a species we had spent 80 years dismissing as too soft for war. I remember a moment, small and strange amid all that chaos, when a single human vessel passed close enough to our own hull that its outline filled our forward viewport entirely. It did not fire. It simply held position for a few seconds, close enough that I could see, through my own optics, a marking painted along its side, the name Meridian Hope, written in careful human letters, the same name as the transport ship destroyed all those months before. I understood, in that moment, exactly what this fleet had been built to answer, and exactly why nothing we had prepared for was going to be enough. Captain Thorne ordered a retreat within the hour, one of the first Concord commanders in living memory to give that order without a fight to the last ship, and I believe it saved every life still aboard the Halvex. Other captains, proud in the way Counselor Reladine had been proud, chose to hold their positions, certain that reinforcements or simple stubborn resistance would turn the tide. I watched their ships on our secondary displays as we withdrew, and I will not describe in detail what happened to those formations, only that within a single day, 3 Concord fleets that had stood unchallenged for over a century were no longer a meaningful force in that sector at all. News of the defeat reached the Council within hours, and I am told the chamber that had spent 6 hours calmly debating whether humans were even capable of sustained warfare spent the following 6 hours in something closer to open panic. Counselor Reladine, the same voice who had called humanity incapable, was reportedly the loudest in demanding immediate full mobilization, as if the word incapable had never left his mouth at all. I did not witness that meeting myself, but I heard enough second-hand accounts from officers who had been present to understand that pride, once broken, breaks quickly and completely, and that the same voices who had dismissed humanity as harmless were now the ones most desperate to convince everyone else that they had known the danger all along. What struck me most, in the days that followed, was not the strength of the human fleets, though that strength was very real. It was their restraint. I expected, given everything we had done to them, a war of pure destruction, an attempt to erase every trace of Concord presence from every system they touched. That is not what happened. Human forces struck military targets with precision and left civilian infrastructure almost entirely untouched. Colonies that had been governed by Concord administrators for decades found their governors quietly removed and their systems handed back to local control, with human liaison officers left behind only to ensure an orderly transition, not to install a new form of the same old rule. It was, I came to understand, exactly what Charlotte Pierce had told Captain Thorne aboard our own ship days before. This was never meant to be conquest. It was meant to be a lesson, delivered as precisely and deliberately as everything else humanity had done since that first broadcast reached our ears. I was reassigned during this period to a smaller support vessel, tasked with monitoring communications along a border that had, only weeks before, been considered entirely secure. It was there that I first began to hear stories from other officers, quiet accounts passed between crews who had faced human forces directly and lived to describe it. A weapons officer named Nathan Cole, captured briefly during a skirmish and released within days under terms none of us expected, once agreed to describe a human command structure that relied on trust between crew members rather than the rigid hierarchy the Concorde had always depended on. He described watching junior human officers make decisions in the middle of a battle without waiting for approval from a superior 3 ranks above them, decisions that turned out, again and again, to be correct. I remember asking him, foolishly, whether he was afraid of the humans he had faced. He told me something I have never forgotten. He said the humans he encountered showed no anger at all, not even when they had every reason to. He said they fought the way someone fights when they have already made peace with what they are doing, calmly, deliberately, without hesitation, and without cruelty. He said that frightened him far more than open rage ever could have, because rage burns hot and eventually fades, but calm, patient resolve does not, and there is no way to wait out an enemy who was never fighting out of anger in the first place. By the end of that first month, the Concorde had lost control of every border system it had once considered secure without question. Entire fleets, built and maintained for centuries, had either been disabled, withdrawn, or destroyed in engagements that our own analysts still struggled to fully explain. I remember standing on the deck of my new assignment, looking out at a star field that had once felt entirely ours, and understanding, with total clarity, that the galaxy the Concorde had ruled for so long no longer existed, and that a new one, shaped by a species we had never once bothered to understand, had already taken its place. The Concorde did not fall all at once. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy, looking back, to imagine the collapse as sudden and total, a single overwhelming blow that ended everything. It was not like that. It was slower, and in some ways harder to watch, because it meant that every single day brought a new piece of proof that the world we had built our lives around was never as strong as we had believed it to be. I was transferred, 6 weeks into the conflict, to a defense posting near a system called Threnvale, one of the oldest and most heavily fortified Concorde core worlds, a place so far from the human border that many of us believed it would never see real fighting at all. It had stood as a symbol of Concorde permanence for longer than any living species could remember, ringed by defense platforms built over centuries and garrisoned by fleets drawn from a dozen member species. If there was one place in known space that felt untouchable, it was Threnvale, and I remember feeling something close to relief when I received my orders, believing I had finally been sent somewhere safe. I was wrong, and I should have known better by then, because nowhere humanity chose to go ever turned out to be the place we expected. The attack on Threnvale began without warning, the same way every human engagement had begun since the war started, but the scale of it was different from anything I had witnessed before. Long-range sensors detected a single massive formation approaching from a direction our defense grid had never been designed to watch closely, a blind spot we did not even know we had until human ships were already moving through it. I remember the confusion on the command deck when the alert came in, officers checking and rechecking their instruments, certain there had to be some mistake, because no fleet should have been able to approach that system from that angle without being seen days in advance. There was no mistake. Humanity had studied our defenses for months, perhaps longer, learning the exact shape of every blind spot our centuries-old fortifications had never bothered to correct, because no enemy in living memory had ever been clever enough or patient enough to find them. I understood, watching that formation appear on our displays, that this had never been a war fought with more powerful weapons. It had been a war fought by a species willing to study its enemy far more carefully than its enemy had ever bothered to study them. The commander of the human fleet at Threnvale was a woman named Laura Bennett, and I did not learn her name until much later, after the battle had ended and the terms of surrender were already being discussed. I only knew, in the moment, that whoever commanded those ships fought with a discipline that made every Concord tactic look outdated by comparison. Her formations did not simply overwhelm our defense platforms. They dismantled them piece by piece, isolating each station from the others before striking, cutting off communication so quickly that half our garrison did not even know the battle had begun until it was already ending around them. I served that day aboard a support cruiser assigned to relay communications between our scattered defense stations, and I remember the moment our own channel went dark, cut off mid-sentence while a station commander was still requesting reinforcements that would never arrive. I remember the silence that followed, the same kind of silence I had felt in the days before the war began, except this time I understood exactly what it meant, and there was no comfort left in not knowing. What I remember most clearly from that day, more than the battle itself, was what happened after our station was disabled and boarded by human forces. I expected violence. I expected, given everything that had happened, a reckoning delivered without mercy, because I believed, even then, that this was what our own species would have done in humanity's place. That is not what happened. The officer who led the boarding party aboard our cruiser was a young man named Daniel Cross, calm and unhurried, in a way that unsettled me more than any show of anger could have. He ordered his people to secure the bridge without harming a single member of our crew, and once the ship was under his control, he did something I have never fully understood until much later. He asked to speak with our surviving officers, one at a time, and he listened to each of us, patiently, as we explained our roles and our orders, before informing us that we would be transferred to a holding station rather than treated as enemies to be punished. I asked him, when it came my turn, why humanity showed this kind of restraint after everything the Concord had done to them. His answer was quiet, and it has stayed with me every day since, the same way Ethan Marsh's words had stayed with me weeks before. He said that humanity had not gone to war to become the thing they had spent 80 years suffering under. He said cruelty was easy, and any species could learn it quickly if given enough reason, but that his people had decided, long before the first shot was fired, that they would win this war without becoming an enemy worth fearing in the way the Concord had once been feared by them. He said the goal was never to make us suffer. The goal was only to make sure that suffering like the Meridian Hope could never be dismissed again as acceptable within tolerance. I did not know how to answer him. I do not think I have ever fully answered that question, even now. News of Threnvale's fall spread through the remaining Concord fleets within a day, and I believe it broke something in the Council that no earlier defeat had managed to break. Threnvale had been a symbol for longer than most species had existed as spacefaring civilizations, proof that Concord permanence could never truly be threatened, and its loss removed the last comfortable illusion that any of us had left. I remember hearing, from officers who had been present in the chamber, that Councillor Rel Adine resigned his position within hours of the news reaching him, unable to face a council he had spent months reassuring with confidence that had cost so many lives. In the weeks that followed, engagement after engagement ended the same way, not with the total destruction many of us had feared, but with careful, deliberate human control taking hold of system after system, always with the same pattern. Military targets disabled or destroyed, civilian infrastructure left largely untouched, local governance returned to the people who had actually lived there, often for the first time in generations, while human liaison officers remained only long enough to ensure the transition held. I remember speaking, during my time in the holding station, with a woman named Emma Foss, a logistics officer among the humans overseeing our transfer, who explained something that finally made the entire pattern make sense to me. She said her people had spent 80 years studying exactly how the Concord governed its member species, cataloging every unfair treaty and every quiet injustice, not simply to remember what had been done to humanity, but to understand what had been done to everyone else as well. She said the war was never only about humans. It was about proving, to every species living under Concord rule, that the arrangement they had been told was permanent and unchangeable could in fact be changed, and that no species, however small it seemed, needed to remain patient forever. I think that is the moment I finally understood the true size of what humanity had built. It was not simply a fleet, however impressive that fleet had turned out to be. It was an argument, carried across 1,000 systems by ships that had waited 80 years to make their point, and delivered with a precision and restraint that made the argument impossible to dismiss as simple anger or revenge. I had spent my entire career believing that patience was a form of weakness, something the Concord could rely on other species to display forever without consequence. Standing in that holding station, watching human officers oversee the return of governance to worlds that had known nothing but Concord rule for generations, I finally understood how completely we had misunderstood what patience actually was. By the time the last major Concord fleet withdrew from contested space, barely 3 months after the first broadcast had reached our ears, I no longer felt the fear that had gripped me during those early battles. What I felt instead was something closer to a slow, aching recognition, the kind that comes when you finally see clearly something you had refused to look at directly for far too long. We had spent 80 years teaching humanity exactly what the galaxy expected from a species with no power to resist. We had never once considered what might happen once that species finally decided it had learned enough, and had quietly, patiently, built the power to answer in kind. The peace talks began 4 months after the first broadcast, held not in the Grand Concord Chamber, where I had once stood listening to Counselor Rel Aiden dismiss an entire species as incapable, but on neutral ground, a modest space station near the border that both sides had agreed to treat as equal territory for the first time in 80 years. I was not present as a negotiator. I was there as part of a small honor escort assigned to the remaining Concord delegation, a quiet, humbled group of officials who bore almost no resemblance to the confident council I remembered from before the war began. I remember watching the human delegation arrive, led by a woman named Grace Holloway, the same woman I had seen decades earlier, straining her neck to speak to officials who would not look down at her, asking politely for fair prices on fuel cells, and being denied without a second thought. She was older now, her hair silvered, her posture no less patient than it had been all those years before, but there was something different in the way the room responded to her. Nobody looked past her this time. Every eye in that chamber, Concord and human alike, was fixed entirely on what she had to say. She did not gloat. I want to be honest about that, because some part of me expected her to, after everything her people had endured and everything the Concord had lost in return. She did not raise her voice or list every grievance from 80 years of unfair treaties. She simply laid out humanity's terms, calmly, the same way she had once laid out simple requests for fair trade, except this time nobody in that room had the power to deny her. The terms were not what I expected. Humanity did not demand territory beyond what they already controlled through the natural course of the fighting. They did not demand reparations large enough to cripple the remaining Concord economy, though by any measure they would have been justified in asking for far more than they did. What they demanded instead was a restructuring of the Council itself, a new charter guaranteeing every member species, regardless of size or military strength, an equal voice in decisions that affected their worlds, and an independent body, staffed by representatives from every species including humanity, with the authority to review and overturn any policy that treated the loss of civilian life as an acceptable cost of doing business. I remember a Concord official, one of the few who still carried some of the old pride, asking Grace Holloway directly why humanity had not simply demanded more, given how thoroughly they could have crushed what remained of Concord military strength. Her answer was quiet, and I believe it will be remembered, in whatever histories are eventually written about this war, as the moment the true purpose of humanity's fight finally became clear to everyone listening. She said that humanity had never wanted to become the new masters of a galaxy built on the same unfair foundations as before. She said that if they demanded everything simply because they now had the power to take it, they would have proven nothing except that power alone decides what is fair, and that was the exact lesson the Concord had spent 80 years teaching every smaller species under its rule. She said humanity wanted something better than that, a galaxy where no species, however small or new or seemingly harmless, could ever again be told that their losses fell within someone else's tolerance. I do not think I fully understood, until that moment, what humanity had actually been fighting for. It had never been about defeating the Concord for its own sake. It had been about proving, through the clearest and most undeniable demonstration possible, that patience was never a sign of weakness, and that a species willing to endure decades of unfair treatment while quietly preparing to answer it deserved to be heard, not because they had finally become strong enough to force the issue, but because they had been right to demand fairness all along, long before they ever had the power to enforce it. The new charter was signed 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that felt smaller and quieter than the moment truly deserved, given everything it represented. I was present, standing near the edge of the chamber, when representatives from every Concord member species, humanity included, placed their names beside terms that would have been unthinkable a year before. I watched officials who had once looked past human delegates without a second glance now sit at the same table, as equals, discussing the future of a galaxy none of us fully recognized anymore. I think often about a conversation I had, shortly after the signing, with Ethan Marsh, the young technician who had told me, on the last quiet night before the war began, that patience, which finally moves, does not stop until it finishes what it set out to do. I found him working, once again, on communication arrays, this time helping to establish the new independent review body's monitoring network, the very system meant to ensure that no future Meridian hope would ever again be dismissed with 5 careless words. I asked him whether he felt satisfied with how everything had ended. He told me satisfaction was not quite the right word. He said his people had not fought this war to feel good about winning it. They had fought it so that winning would no longer be necessary, so that future generations, human and otherwise, would never have to build a hidden fleet across 3 generations simply to be heard. I think about Charlotte Pierce, too, the envoy who walked onto our bridge unarmed and told Captain Thorne, calmly, that this was a demonstration, and demonstrations did not require anyone's permission. I learned, much later, that she went on to serve on the new review body herself, one of its first and most respected voices, arguing not only for human interests, but for the interests of smaller species who had suffered under Concord policy for far longer than humanity ever had, species who had never had the strength to build a fleet of their own and simply endured, the way humans once endured, hoping someone would eventually listen. I think most of all about my own part in all of this, small as it was. I was not a decision maker. I did not sit on the council or command a fleet. I was simply an officer who watched, closely enough, to notice the anomalies nobody else wanted to investigate, and who still, despite noticing, said nothing, because I trusted a system that had never once earned that trust, and had simply never been tested closely enough to prove it. I think about the colleague who laughed beside me in that chamber, all those months ago, when Henry Voss walked out after hearing his people's deaths described as acceptable within tolerance, and I think about how easily I laughed along with him. I do not laugh anymore when humans are mentioned in any Concord briefing. Nobody does. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls across a room now whenever a human envoy speaks. Not fear exactly, though fear is certainly part of it, but something closer to a hard-earned respect, the kind that only comes after underestimating someone so completely and so publicly that the mistake becomes impossible to repeat. I do not know what the next 80 years will bring. I do not know whether the new charter will hold, whether the review body will remain strong enough to stop the next quiet injustice before it grows into another meridian hope, another silence, another broadcast that ends a galaxy's comfortable assumptions in the space of 5 words. I only know that I was there, at the edge of it all, when the line finally broke, and that I will carry the memory of that broadcast, that calm and steady voice announcing the end of 80 years of patience, for as long as I live. We are done asking, it said. Now you will finally listen. I think, in the end, that we finally did.